stoked to be with all of you. And with all due respect to all of you, I am even more stoked to be with these two incredible gentlemen. Austin Peterson from Ovid Winery and Nate Weiss from Silver Oak. Gentlemen, how are you today?
Fantastic.
Doing great, Paul. Thanks for having us.
Oh, guys, listen, we can get a little more enthusiasm than fantastic and great, for God's sakes. We're with the people of America, and we're talking grape juice. I don't know if there's anything better to be in this world. So, gentlemen, once again, how are you both today?
Awesome.
I think calling us gentlemen might be a bit of a stretch, but here we are.
Awesome. Listen, guys, let's do, I like the niceties of this life of ours, and I think we should raise a glass and toast each other and all the people who are out there joining us for this extraordinary conversation about wine, California wine, and Napa Valley wine that rocks. People of America, Austin, Nate, big cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers to that.
So to get this story going, I believe a little background is important. Nate, let's begin with you. Give us a little bit of your backstory, if you would, please, before you arrived at Silver Oak.
My backstory. Well, I grew up, actually, Austin and I are both locals, believe it or not. I grew up in the Napa Valley. My father was a winemaker. He started his career in the early 70s with Robert Mondavi. So I grew up around wine and vineyards as part of my life and part of the table from a very early age. And like any kid that grows up in the Napa Valley, I wanted to get out. So I went to UC Santa Barbara because they had beaches and they had waves and they had some good parties. And at some point decided I was actually going to have to work for a living, which was a terrible day in my life, but a good one, an important one, and really thought the wine business would be pretty cool. I mean, we get to play with tractors and drive forklifts and wear jeans to work and stuff like that. And so kind of went back to school, went to UC Davis, which is actually where Austin and I first met. I won't tell you how long ago now, but it's been a while. And, along the way, I sort of initially focused on Pinot Noir. I worked for Etude Wines with John Priest and Tony Soder. Moved on to Patson Hall, where I worked for James Hall, which was a great learning experience for me. And then I was the winemaker for the Antinori family at their property on Atlas Peak for six vintages before I came to Silver Oak in 2014.
Awesome. During that time there, you must have staged outside of the country.
I did. I spent a harvest, well, really two harvests in New Zealand. I spent sort of an early one and a late one back in 2003. And that was actually a really formative time, both personally, because I sort of packed everything I owned and went to this little island in the middle of nowhere, which was a very, formative experience from a personal point of view. And I met a guy named Doug Weiser, who was the winemaker for Craigie Range, and really taught me a lot about not so much the intricacies of the craft, I would say, because I was still so green. I was trying to figure out which side of a pump was the inside and which side was the outside. But he taught me a lot about the way you approach your work and really learning everything about how a winery operates, every intricacy of a winery and applying that to what you do and really solving problems.
Awesome. And Austin, so UC Davis, yes?
Yep.
And staged?
Yeah. Both Napa, Sonoma, and then France, South Africa, Australia, Argentina, and New Zealand. It was a lovely time in life, just kind of bouncing from one place to the other and, working a few months during the harvest and saving my money and then traveling that quadrant of the globe and then hopping to the next harvest and working with the next folks. And yeah, I'd do that again in a second. That was great.
It's like the endless summer, but for wine.
Yeah.
Is it, all I've ever done in my life is work in the restaurant business, and I've done it for 35 years, and you would think, well, I've worked in a multitude of joints in a multitude of places around the world, and to be honest, no, it's been New York and my hometown of Toronto. But you have this unbelievable ability, especially when you're a student of winemaking, to get two harvests a year on opposite sides of the planet. When you, Austin, arrived in Australia, I think you said, did you just slot in immediately, or it takes a few days to adjust to what, like, I guess we say about Australia, the toilet bowl moves in the opposite direction. Do they do everything at the winery the opposite way of the way we do it here in America?
There's a lot of times that it felt that way. there's some serious questions for sure, but you know, there's a commonality and common language with wine, and certainly in the cellar. And when you show up and you have some familiarity in the cellar, it's pretty easy to drop in and start speaking the same language. And you know, it doesn't take long to kind of find your groove in a new spot.
Now, Nate, I'll get back to you in a second. Austin, you've been at Ovid since '06, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
When you were at UC Davis, did you fall in love with Cabernet and Cabernet-based wines there? So now you're doing exactly what you were meant to do with this life? Or was Cabernet, you know, somewhere out in the distance, you morphed into this Cabernet hound?
Um, I've never been one to really have a plan. And that kind of plays into a lot of how we make wines here at Ovid and how I guess I suppose I've lived my life, but I'm much more one for experimentation. And so I didn't think that Ovid was going to be a full-time thing. I was on my way to South Africa and I had plans to go work in China and Italy. And so I just kind of happened into that job, and it's been a good fit. And you know, I think similar to Nate, I grew up in the area and my dad was a winemaker, and so I similarly did my best to run away as much as possible. And I think that there's something that just kind of that kept bringing me back. So Cabernet ultimately ends up being a kind of natural fit for me. But I'm still waiting for divine intervention. There wasn't any grand plan. It just it happened to come together that way. And it's been a fun ride.
Well, for a dude who says he didn't have a plan, I have no clue what's on the chalkboard behind you. I don't know if that's virtual or if that's real, but someone is planning something major in that world of yours. Now, Nate,
you know, we've got a lot of hope there. I think that says "rain, rain, go away" in the corner. So there's tic-tac-toe on the other shoulder.
if you say so, sir. So, Nate, for you, were you a Cabernet hound when you were at UC Davis?
You know, actually, when I started out, much influenced by my time in New Zealand, I was really focused on Pinot Noir. That was kind of my gig and something I was chasing just because it was a very interesting variety. You know, it changes a lot depending on where you grow it. And so that was kind of the common theme. And actually throughout my career, you know, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay were sort of the two themes. Working for Etude and then for the Antinoris, we also made plenty of Cabernet as well. But they were common threads throughout my career, and actually still here at Silver Oak. While I kind of act as the winemaker for Silver Oak, we also have a brand called Toomey where we make a lot of different Pinot Noirs and believe it or not, starting to mess around with Chardonnay and hoping to make that a real thing. So that was kind of what I was focused on early on. But you know, like Austin, it's sort of when the opportunity knocks, you kind of answer the door. And so if Cabernet was where it was going to be, that was great for me. What I was really searching for when I came to Silver Oak was a place I felt like I really belonged. I was looking for culture. I was looking for people that had a similar vision to what I had about who we are and what we do and how we do it. And I really found that here. It was like, you know, finding that box you fit into just perfectly.
You are the third, I guess, head winemaker at Silver Oak. The first one, of course, Justin Meyer, who helped found the goddamn thing back in 1972. And then Daniel Barron comes in '94. And he and Justin worked together. So there was a beautiful, long, slow, mature handoff. And you got to work with Daniel Barron also, correct?
That's correct. We had I still work with him, really. I've been here for 7 years. He officially retired at the end of 2016, but he kind of hung out his shingle as a consultant, and he's still, we're his biggest client. So I still taste wines with him. I still blend with him. He's still here and kind of hanging around for important decision-making. And actually, it's a pretty cool gig because he gets to get involved in the stuff that he likes, which is the winemaking and the grape growing, and gets to avoid stuff like doing budgets and performance reviews and all the fun stuff we get to do as employees.
And when you started there and in that transition, Silver Oak is still family owned, the Duncan clan. You have the third generation now engaged, which is pretty awesome in so many different ways. did you have to toe the party line, so to speak, or are you given? We all understand the variables of vintages, so there's some differences there certainly. But is there a Silver Oak box that someone said, Nate, dude, you need to stay in the box. There's no going off reservation.
It's an interesting question. If you line Justin Meyer, God rest his soul, Daniel and I up, you probably couldn't find three more different people in terms of who we are and the way we approach life and work and so on. Justin being a former man of the cloth and a member of the Christian Brothers, and Daniel sort of an artistic, creative type from the East Coast, and me being a California kid that's agnostic, and I go to church for Easter and Christmas sometimes, and weddings and funerals. But I think one of the reasons we all kind of ended up here is we all see the wine world the same way and what we want Silver Oak to be. Winemaking is very personal. There are definitely differences in what we value when we're looking at different wines and as we blend on the blending bench. And certainly I met Justin Meyer. I certainly never worked with him. He passed away in the early 2000s, but listening to Daniel tell stories about their interactions when they were working together, they had different ideas about what Silver Oak could be. So the answer is kind of yes and no, because of course we value consistency. When people taste Silver Oak, regardless of the vintage, there's an expectation of a certain quality and a certain wine style that we fit into. And I think part of that is because Daniel, Justin, and I all kind of saw wine the same way, which is, it's an accompaniment to food, belongs at the table. We shouldn't take it too seriously. It's not too incredibly precious. It's about the way people interact and the things that they experience over a glass of wine in a meal in a family setting or something like that. So the answer, the best answer is yes and no.
Well, generally, as my mother reminds me every day, I'm not satisfied with an answer like that, Nate. We have to dig a little bit deeper. But before we do, and Austin, you're up next, we should tell the people of America that we have some awesome wines in front of us today, which you can, of course, get from Benchmark. So we have the 16, the Napa Valley bottling. And Nate, these are the new releases on the market, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we have a really long release cycle. The wines spend 2 full years in barrel and then a year and a half to 2 years in bottle. So our current releases are 2016s.
That's awesome. And we also have the Alexander Valley bottling, 16. And then from Austin, we have the Ovid, the 17 bottling right here. Now, dare I ask, before we get back to Cabernet up on Pritchard Hill, why is this called, in brackets, experiment?
So it's actually one of our wines that we release as experiment. So we have the Ovid and Hexameter, which are the Cab and Cab Franc dominant blends, and then really the flagship or co-flagships of the estate. And then we have this series of wines called Experiment, and they're really one-off ideas from us each and every year, where we're exploring a new idea or trying, to push the boundaries, or at least what we know to be the boundaries in winemaking or in the vineyard. And we bottle up enough and release it to kind of share that journey with folks that want to come along with us.
So, Austin, as Nate has said, you both grew up in the Valley, yes?
Uh-huh.
During my teenage years, I went out and drank a ton of beer and ate a lot of pizza and burgers. Growing up in Napa Valley, when you went out with your mates in high school, were you guys drinking like kick-ass Cabernets and other, varietals like that with the burgers and the pizza and stuff?
No, I was in the same camp.
Okay, good.
Actually, I didn't want to admit to what I was drinking in high school. But kind of tangentially to that, at home there would always be wine open, and that would be, various winemakers would stop in on their way home, and they'd share a bottle with my folks, and they'd pour a glass for me, and they'd talk about, oh, hey, this is a Viognier Roussanne co-ferment I did, and yada yada yada, or here's some Cabernet from Owl Mountain, or whatever it was. And that was always a treat, and that's one of those things that kind of sunk the hook for me in terms of how cool the wine industry could be. It still took me another few years to really try and realize that that's what I wanted to do, but that was certainly kind of how that hook got set.
So, but when you arrive up on Pritchard Hill in '06, and I love history and it's the market leaves. Confession is my first trip to Napa Valley as a young aspiring somm back in the late '80s. Um, I did visit Silver Oak. I have some vague recollection of actually meeting Justin Meyer. I was in Toronto at the time, certainly influenced by Parker. And I don't think the noun, adverb, adjective, whatever the hell it is, Parkerization, but there were Parker wines, wineries, and Silver Oak was certainly one of them in the '80s. And that was cool because it opened up this world of Napa Valley wine to me. And I love those Silver Oaks that I was experiencing back in the '80s. I don't think I was lucky enough to try any of the earlier stuff from the '70s, but impressive. So that's my entree into today's conversation. So I am super stoked to revisit these things. And so Austin, to Pritchard Hill, Mr. Pritchard, I believe first planted this area back in 1890, and I am a Riesling hound. And the fact that apparently the first harvest was Zinfandel and Riesling made my heart flutter, for God's sakes. So with all due respect to Cabernet, do you think we should rip out all the Cabernet on Pritchard Hill and just plant Riesling? Do you think that is our future?
I think you should probably talk to our accountants about that one. There was some fantastic Rieslings made back in the day. I think Chapelet had a few back in the '60s or late '60s, early '70s. I don't know that the future, particularly with climate change and the taking significant effect, is really going to favor Riesling on Pritchard Hill. But certainly, it's a good question to ask, and it's good to be continuing to ask the questions of what is best suited to which places in Napa.
Well, listen, such a big question requires a sip of wine, at least for my brain to keep working. Hold on a sec, gentlemen.
I mean, when I see Pritchard Hill, I think, it looks exactly like the Mosel to me, right?
I mean, there is a lot of rock, and it is quite steep.
So, but Austin, so you first arrive up here, and my first, I think, time ever uttering the words Pritchard Hill, I know Chapelet was the renaissance of this place, and maybe even in some ways, the beginning of Pritchard Hill back in the '60s. But it was, I think, Bryant family up there in my world in the '90s that sort of opened up this, where is Pritchard Hill? Where is this appellation? Where is it in relation to Highway 29? Blah, blah, blah. So you get up there in '06, it's certainly become a Cabernet promised land by then. Why is Cabernet and Cabernet driven wines on Pritchard Hill the proverbial poop?
It is the poop for a variety of reasons. And if I had some virtual chalk, I'd draw it out on the virtual chalkboard. It's actually, surprisingly enough, fantastic for Cabernet. It's even more fantastic for Cabernet Franc. And so Pritchard Hill itself is, and certainly where we sit is this rock plateau. That's all this volcanic andesite, and it's just like 3 to 4 feet of it, and it's incredibly, incredibly rocky. And so, given that it's a volcanic clay loam, there's enough water holding capacity in those 3 to 4 feet to really sustain the vines through most of the growing season. But it induces a fair bit of stress on the vines. And Cabernet Franc, like most vines, are a lot like people. If they have a kind of really easy life, they're generally pretty boring. If they have a super, super stressful life, they're freaked out and shut down. But enough stress really, creates these very, characterful folks that have a lot of stories to tell. And that's the same for Cabernet and Cabernet Franc. A little bit of stress, good sunlight, good exposure, lots of rock, and they make these really compelling and beautiful wines.
But listen, Austin, great answer, but I know you can do better than that. So north of you, if my geography is correct, we're going to eventually get to Howell Mountains. South of you is Stag's Leap. So how is Pritchard Hill specifically different than those from a terroir standpoint, and also what I am going to find in a glass of your grape juice?
Sure. So Pritchard Hill to the north of us is really Lake Hennessy, and basically from there you get into much more volcanics, or much different volcanics, I should say. It's much more of the tufa, the ash driven, rather than the actual volcanic flow uplift, which makes up more of Pritchard Hill. And then to the south of us, we have Foss Valley and Atlas Peak. And so Pritchard Hill is interesting in that it's almost like this plateau, and it's very different for each estate. They have different exposures, which makes a huge difference in how the wines express themselves. But you can think of it as this volcanic rock uplifting, that the top is just sloughed off and down into the valley, forming Oakville Ranch and Dolaval and the Bacchus Vineyard for Phelps and Screaming Eagle and Tench and Red. And what was left was just like solid rock. And then the location for us on the east side of the valley, it puts us right in the rain shadow of Mount Veeder. So we don't get very much rain. And that means that that solid rock is not degraded all that far or all that deep. So we're really only looking at 4 feet of soil before you get back to what that base bedrock is. And so kind of location between the two, Howell Mountain being higher and Atlas Peak being higher, collect their own rain, collect their own weather. And Pritchard Hill being a little bit lower sits in that rain shadow and is completely different from what's north of us and what's south of us.
Do you irrigate up there?
We do. We do our best not to, and we've done a ton of research on that. That one is for sure. I could fill hours talking about how vines use water and what that does in terms of the fruit expression in the end. But essentially, what we do is we withhold water essentially till the grapes start to turn color. And in the best vintages in Bordeaux, the classic thing is that it rains through May and into early June. It's dry from then until early August, which is about when you have veraison, or the change in color for the fruit, and then you get steady rains after that. In essence, that's what we're trying to kind of mimic. Is you have a dry summer, the vines rein in their vigor, they grow the proper length, the fruit's really small and dense, and then once it turns color and starts to produce all that flavor and color, then we give it water, and we irrigate as though it was a big rain. So
I'm good. I want you to ponder a question before, because I need to know the differences in the glass between Hennessy, Howell, Pritchard Hill, and Stag's Leap. But my big question of the day, and then I'm going to go to sleep after asking it. If you irrigate, is the resulting wine not a truly terroir-driven wine? I'll let that sink in for a moment, Austin. But sure. Back to the glass quickly. What do I find in the glass on Pritchard Hill versus Stag's Leap versus Hennessy versus Howell Mountain?
Sure. So on Pritchard Hill, what I've found, and it extends a little bit down the hill from us into East Oakville, is much more of that kind of bright red fruit driven wines. So more of the pomegranate and currant, and then we have lots of natural wild sage on the property. So I find sage and bay laurel, which we also have quite a bit of on the property. Those are kind of the signature notes if I was to take a really broad strokes of what Pritchard Hill is like. As you go north to Howell Mountain, that's much more, you get more into those black, or like kind of brambly blackberry characters, and more forest floor. And if you go south of us, like Stag's Leap being a little bit cooler, you get more of those blue fruits in Cabernet that are actually kind of reminiscent of the west side of the valley. So it's one way to think of it, as kind of that distinction.
Gotcha, love it. Oh, cool. Nate, some history. So when Ray and Justin start this thing, first vintage 72, Ray's out there buying land, vineyards, land in the late 60s to plant. They end up buying a dairy farm on the valley floor, which is, I believe, where your office is, right?
I am in the midst of that former dairy farm, yes.
Cool. So when you get up in the morning, grab your cup of coffee, first thing you're going to do, of course, walk outside and look east, and you get to look up, just over your right shoulder to Pritchard Hill. Do you say, damn, I wish I was up there on the mountain versus the valley floor?
Sometimes I do. Yes, I love looking up at what Austin's got going on, especially recently. It's easier to see right now.
And Austin, do you ever look down upon Nate and what he's got going on down there and say, I am so goddamn happy to be up on high?
No, Nate's got a lot of interesting things going on, and it's that's been one of the fun things of joining the Silver Oak family or the Duncan family, is the collaboration between the two and the chance to see new and different things outside of our four walls. It kind of plays nicely with the experimentation that both Silver Oak and Ovid do, and that we're really committed and interested to asking questions, trying new things, and seeing what we can discover in the process. And so there's a lot more phone calls than than getting out on the veranda and gazing out on the valley.
Gotcha. So Nate, back to Silver Oak history. The first wine that Silver Oak released in '72 was Alexander Valley, bottled as the North Coast Bottling. Cool stuff. And the first Napa Valley wine was released '79.
It was either 78 or 79. I don't entirely remember.
Gotcha.
72, there was the AVA system didn't exist until 1978.
Yeah. So Ray and Justin planted that dairy farm, and that was the original Napa Valley vineyard?
Yes, that was some of the original vineyard. The partnership at one point also owned a lot of vineyard around Franciscan. They owned the winery Franciscan that was bought out of bankruptcy. And so, over time, though, those vineyards were eventually sold off as part of the Franciscan brand.
And do you know the original plantings that Justin did? Where did the budwood come from? And I don't want to dive too deep into a clonal conversation of Cabernet, but what were the Cabernet clones that were planted on that original plot of land for Silver Oak?
I don't know the answer to that for sure, but back at that point in the late '60s, early '70s, a lot of the budwood was coming from Beaulieu, from BV vineyards, which was a source of a lot of what we call sort of the California selections at this point.
And were there different types of Cabernet in that blend, or is the clonal conversation of Cabernet not as large as it is for Pinot Chard, blah, blah, blah?
I think clones for Cabernet are really important, and Bordeaux varieties in general. I think at that point, people were just collecting budwood from people who were making great wine. And so, when you collect budwood as well, and you're just grafting onto rootstock, either dormant or in the ground, you're not even really working with a clone per se. You're working with kind of what they might call a selection, so to speak. And Justin did select some very special stuff for his own personal vineyard at his house across the street in Oakville that is now called the Bonnie's clone. And actually, we still work with some of that. He took that material and took it to a vineyard in St. Helena that we've been buying grapes from now for damn near 40 years, something like that. And it's if you look on the map, it's really cool to see. It says Bonnie's clone right there. But I suspect that was probably BV6 or something like that.
Now you've just triggered something. I guess on that visit back to Silver Oak in the late '80s, what were the bottlings that you were doing back then? Because it wasn't just Napa and Alexander. Was there a vineyard Bonnie's?
There was a Bonnie's Vineyard bottling, yeah. And in the early days, they said, look, we're going to make one wine and only one wine. And then the AVA system came about, and they said, well, we grow grapes in Napa Valley, we grow grapes in Alexander Valley, and now there's sort of a distinction there, and there's a system, and it means something on a bottle. So I'm sure there were boardroom fights about whether or not to make two bottlings, but they ended up doing that in either '78 or '79. And I believe it was '79 they started making the Bonnie's Vineyard, and so that was a smaller bottling. I think it was in the 300 to 500 cases most years, from Justin's home property named after his wife Bonnie Meyer, and they made it for many years. And I think eventually Justin got very sick of it. Actually, the stories I've heard are that all he would ever hear is complaints about, I want Bonnie's Vineyard, I can't get it. It's I'm a really good customer of Silver Oak, why can't I get the Bonnie's Vineyard? And eventually at some point he just had it with that and said, you know what, forget this. I'm sick of that. let's go ahead and just blend it into the Napa, and I won't have to deal with this stuff anymore out in the marketplace.
And so
there were three until 1991, and then that's when he sort of cut the cord on the Bonnie's Vineyard and started blending that into the Napa.
And cool, Justin's focus on a single varietal Cabernet, and that being the singular focus with Ray at Silver Oak. What's the origin story of that?
Again, we're getting into revisionist history. When they started the winery,
you can tell lies and innuendo. No one is paying attention to what we're saying today, so make it up as far as I'm concerned.
That's actually, the first course you take at UC Davis is how to make stuff up when people ask you questions about wine and winemaking, because you just have to say it with confidence. But what I think happened is, when Justin was a member of the order and making wine for Christian Brothers, they were making still wines, they were making fortified wines, they were making sweet wines, they had every variety under the sun. It was one of those kind of places that if you walked into their tasting room or their winery, and you said, I love Aglianico, they wanted to have an Aglianico bottling to sell you. And I think he got very, as you can tell with the story with Bonnie, I think Justin was a patient man up to a point and then became very gruff. And I think he got quite sick of that. And so when he and Ray started talking about Silver Oak, they said, well, these chateaus, these first growths in Bordeaux, they make one wine, maybe a second wine, and when they feel like it's necessary or the vintage, demands it. Why can't we do that in California? Let's focus on one thing. And they ended up choosing Cabernet. And I think part of that was Justin was a very good winemaker, a very smart man. And it seems like a really obvious choice right now, sitting here in 2021. If they're going to be based in Napa Valley, northern Sonoma County, why not Cabernet Sauvignon? But Cabernet was still a minor player in the overall plantings in the Napa Valley, especially probably till about the late 80s. I think even in vintages like 1989, Chardonnay was still more valuable and more widely planted than Cabernet in Napa Valley. So it was very prescient. It was a very prescient choice, and we've stuck to it now for 50 years.
And not one deviation?
Not one deviation at Silver Oak. Again, we over time, it was, we realized there was a really big wine world out there. We're all wine lovers. Actually, I remember it always comes back to me to when I worked for James Hall, who loved Riesling. He was a Riesling freak. And I said, well, geez, man, you love Riesling so much. Why don't we make a Riesling one year? He said, you know what? Chardonnay and Pinot Noir is our thing. And, let's do really well making Chardonnay and Pinot. I can buy all the Riesling I want. So, we love different wines. There was, the Duncan family, as David Duncan got more involved, it was sort of there's a lot of really cool stuff out there. Let's try some different stuff. But, Silver Oak, life as a Cabernet, we're focused on Cabernet. And that was really where Toomey came from. So Toomey was kind of the avenue to try all this different stuff. And we've had some ill-fated experiments over the years with Toomey, but have done all sorts of different things.
So if I may ask one more historical question, Nate, in addition to Cabernet and being monovarietal at the estate, the choice of American oak now seems crazy town. Back then, during my origin story days in the Valley in the 80s, and the wine that still resonates with me, and I feel myself blessed, was the Beaulieu Private Reserve, George de Latour. And that wine, American oak, goddammit. And I had, still in my learning days of French versus American, trying to figure, I had no idea which was better. They were just different. It was a statement. Because some of the budwood for the Valley floor planning came from Beaulieu, was that where Justin got the idea for American oak? I know there's statements about, well, the presence of American oak has a softer impression than the aggressive French oak, and we can find people who will say the exact opposite, of course. But where did the American oak come from for you guys?
Justin was heavily influenced by Andrei Chelichev from those days at Beaulieu. And I think, back in those days, it was actually pretty hard to get high quality French oak barrels. That's kind of the other interesting thing sitting here 50 years later is that in the 60s, I don't know that the French coopers had really recognized the potential of the American market, and that American winemakers were able and willing to pay higher price for their barrels being exported to the market. And so American oak was kind of like the best thing that they could come by. And the world's, kind of in the same way as Silver Oak's sort of wine style, the world kind of changed around us. And we just said, American oak's kind of what we do. And not only are we not going to switch, let's double down. So we own a cooperage now where we make our own barrels in Missouri. And that cooperage in Silver Oak, I think Justin first found them in the early 80s. He had sort of experimented with different coopers before that. And the cooperage and Silver Oak style and what people recognize about Silver Oak really sort of co-evolved and became very much intertwined. And that's the cooperage we were able to purchase back in the early 2000s.
So if French oak was very expensive and hard to get back in those origin days, certainly by the late 70s with Opus One on the scene and up through the 80s with all the stuff going on and French stuff coming in en masse, Justin and Ray still kept on the straight and narrow on American oak. Crazy. Have you ever done any of your wines in French oak? Just for a side experiment that you're not allowed to tell anyone?
I suspect French oak barrels have entered this cellar at one point or another, but we do make, the Toomey wines are made in French oak. We have a single vineyard wine from our biggest estate vineyard called Timeless. That's also made in French oak, but for Silver Oak, no, it's never really been a consideration. And your question about Opus One, or your statement about Opus One, reminds me, as to your question about the early days of high school, my first sort of pilferage out of my dad's cellar. We're going out with some buddies, and I went into the cellar and said, my dad's never going to notice that this bottle of wine's gone. Pulled a bottle of wine out, we went and had a good time. And literally the next day, my dad came to me and said, hey, I'm missing a bottle out of this vertical. Like, were you in my cellar? I said, God, how did you know? He said, you took a bottle of Opus One out of my cellar. Of course I'm going to know. So my early wine drinking days, we started off with a bang.
Well, listen, Nate, I wish I hung out with you in high school because my origin story wine was Blue Nun, by the way. But we'll save that for another conversation. So, Austin, I know this about Silver Oak, I believe, and I'm curious about you and your wine making. At Silver Oak, apparently, grapes harvested, fermentation, initial wine is made. They then do the tasting and the blending, and it goes into barrel, and it seems like a lot of wineries do the blending after the fact. What do you do up on Pritchard Hill at Ovid? And I know you came into the Silver Oak family only very recently, but is your wine making what I believe to be what most old school? We're making different wines, and then a year or two down the line, we're blending in. What do you do?
That's been the practice up until the 19 vintage. And that's, so we were, given that we planted the vineyard in 2000, and really have only had 15 cracks at making wine from it. We kept things separate for a long time to really evaluate how each block was doing. And each block, it's 15 acres, it's 17 different blocks. Each is a different clone and rootstock combination. And so we really wanted to dive into that, understand which rootstocks worked well for us, what clones worked well for us, how those things adjusted as we adjusted our farming practices and our winemaking practices. And, now that we're 20 years down the line, we have a pretty good idea about that. And so we shifted with the 19 vintage to making the wine. We barrel it down for secondary fermentation or malolactic fermentation. And then as soon as that's done in February or March, we'll actually start to then put the blend together and then put it back to barrel. So, and that's been something that we've been examining for a long time. And it has a lot to do with just how the color and tannin, or the color and structure, works in wine. So
if I put on my simpleton wine hat, which is generally what I wear every day, that methodology makes sense to me. Why, when I read it in relation, Nate, to Silver Oak, and now Austin, you're doing it, why do most wineries do the opposite of that, make the blend after the fact? And I know, Austin, you have, I guess, essentially 1 year, 19, that you've been able to taste and go back and forth and realize the success or failure of this thing. What are the big changes that you see in the resulting wine?
The big shift is that we find that the wines are, so basically what's happening in the wine is that in the first 6 months of the wine's life, the color and the structure are really reactive, and that slows way down after a year. And so if you're blending all these individual components, they're not going to be as apt to really marry well as they are if you're blending them earlier in their life cycle, earlier in their lives. And so for us, what we've seen is certainly with the 19s that the wines are a little bit better integrated. There's more complexity to them. They seem to marry really, really nicely. And yeah, I couldn't be happier with the result. There's, I think, a number of reasons for doing it one way or the other. Certainly for us in the early days, we were looking to try and get more information and try and understand what we had done in 2000 as best we could, such that we'd be ready for the next iteration, whether that was more vineyard or replanting. And so that's paid huge dividends now that we've developed a little bit more acreage. Now that we know that and we understand the phenolics and the chemistry of the wine, now we can really start to say, okay, well, this is probably a better practice and a better end result for us.
So when you did this in 19, was it an impression of holy smogolies, mind blown? Or
short answer is no. The reason for that is, and I think it's very rare in the wine world or in the winemaking world that you do something and the change is so dramatic that you say, what on earth? I can't believe this is a completely different thing. It's usually pretty subtle, but it's like a plane crash, like the plane crashes because of 14 small mistakes. You make great wines by making 14 or 1,000 small but better decisions. And so we could see, we tasted it, some improvement. We can see that in the chemistry. There's a lot of different ways that we can see these improvements, but it wasn't night and day for us, unfortunate to say. I'm still waiting. I'm waiting for that divine intervention, man.
I will come out and visit. It'll be close to divine intervention, maybe.
I'm looking forward to it.
So if you think back to your days at UC Davis and your profs, and I don't want to call anyone out here, did anyone bring up this conversation about when to do the blend of the wine?
That's not that, the blending can be as much about logistics in the cellar as it can be about that finished, that marrying of phenolics. And the difference isn't massive. And it's certainly something that bears more research. So I think that's maybe one of the great things. Davis usually gets a lot of poop for teaching or trying to tell everyone what to do. And I think that was one of the great things at Davis, is they just gave us the tools to explore these things. And then we can go out and figure out how we want to use those tools.
Cool.
Yeah, I would agree.
And Nate, for you, when you arrived, this was already in play. Was this a sort of, what are you talking about? We're doing the blend so early in the wine's life. And how did you greet that methodology?
When it was explained to me, I sort of said, that's actually a really good idea. In past jobs and past roles, I'd been moving the blending earlier and earlier for a lot of different reasons, but one of those was the integration and things like that. And it was explained to me that one of the reasons that's really important to us is we want to blend the wines based on kind of their naked states. The wine's never seen an oak barrel. They're all there. They're in the same spot in their lives. They're done with malolactic. They're sitting in stainless steel tanks. And so we're really blending the wines based on their innate characteristics, which I thought made a lot of sense to me before they go into barrel. The drawback is that, as Austin was alluding to, you lose a little bit of ability to gain information. And I think one of the more underrated qualities in winemaking is humility. So one of the things that we do later on is we take samples of these wines and they sit around, and then when the wine's ready to be released or ready to be bottled, we go back and we taste them blind, and we'll go through these individual components and we'll say, this wine is fantastic. There's no way we didn't use this wine in the blend. It's great. And we look back at the records and we unveil it and we say, oh man, no, we kicked that wine out for this reason or that reason. And then there's other wines we taste that say, man, this wine is terrible. There's no way this isn't a bottle of Silver Oak, and we'll unveil it and say, nope, sure enough, we used that wine, which is one of the really interesting parts of blending is that, Silver Oak is an Appalachian blend. The wines are Appalachian blends. And so it's kind of like certain sports. So I love rugby. I played rugby as a younger man. And it's a cool sport because there's a position on the field for everybody, whether you're short, fat, and slow, or tall and lanky, or small and really fast. There's always a position, and wine blending is kind of the same way. Even wines that individually may not have, they may not stand alone and knock your socks off. As part of a bigger blend, when you need a little piece of something like this, they work really, really well.
Got you. And Jen, I'll ask both of you the same question. Other than harvest and that choice to say, go, is blending Austin for you? Because you're using so many different parts, if only varietal parts at Ovid. Is that the most stressful day for you or days? Or is this like the best day ever?
It's pretty fun. It's fun to see, your 2 years of work in front of you. It's not the most stressful part. And, usually by the time you get to the blending table, so many of the decisions about what the wine is going to be have already been made. So it's more fun to see what you have in front of you. I'd say the most stressful days are usually, right around harvest or being out in the vineyard and, precipitating over, just the right time to mow the cover crop or just the perfect, way to thin the vine. And those are the ones that are really critical, because you're going to get 2 years down the road and realize you either screwed it up or or nailed it. So the blending is more just a fun exercise, and fun to get such a delicious result at the end of it.
Gotcha. Nate, for you, blending or harvest, more stress?
Oh, certainly harvest is more stressful. I think blending, people kind of joke, that's your job. You sit around and taste wine all day. And that's kind of what we're doing here today on a Saturday, is sitting around and tasting wine and enjoying it. But blending is kind of a different, much more tedious process, I would say, where you are kind of trying to unveil the David, right, from all these different pieces that you have. But it can be quite fun, and it's incredibly informative too. That I think I learn something every blending season about what we do and what really matters. And I wouldn't say it's stressful necessarily. One of the other beautiful things about blending so early is that there's no timeline concerns. When you're blending just before bottling, you've got a bottling date, and you better get that blend done in time to get the wine ready for the bottle. And here we're a couple years away, so that's if it takes a month and a half, it takes a month and a half. So I don't find it stressful necessarily, but it can be tedious for sure.
Gotcha. And I want to move to the future, because the conversation of climate change is a vital one as it relates to Mother Earth. But Nate, for you and vineyard sourcing, the backbone of the Silver Oak Napa Valley is now Soda Canyon Ranch Vineyards. When did you all purchase that parcel and plant that?
The family bought it in 1999. A good portion of it was already planted. They bought it from a guy whose business is really, developing vineyard land and then reselling it. A guy named Bill Hill here in the valley. So we planted, I think, an additional 20 to 30 acres on top of what was already there. And it's really been the backbone of the Silver Oak Napa Valley now for quite some time. To put it into context, it's 110 acres of vineyard land and And across all the different properties that the family owns, that's 110 out of about 650.
And so up until then, the vineyards around the dairy farm were the backbone of Silver Oak Napa Valley?
Believe it or not, no, we haven't really made a lot of Cabernet from this area. As I mentioned, the partnership owned Franciscan, and when they sold that off, they sold off a lot of this vineyard that surrounds the winery here in Oakville. So, believe it or not, we only own about 10 acres of vineyard here in Oakville, and we actually grow Sauvignon Blanc here, not Cabernet Sauvignon. So, although we're located in Oakville, there has not been much Oakville Cabernet in our blends for many years now. So. We work a lot on the Atlas Peak. Soda Canyon's kind of in the foothills below that at about 400 feet. And then kind of the Western Oak Knoll district is a heavy one for us, sort of at the base of Mount Leader.
Cool. All right, time, gentlemen, to move to the future. So, Austin, Pritchard Hill, as it's been part of the modern wine conversation in Napa Valley, roughly 50 years of age now. As you look forward over the next 50 years of age as being a steward of this extraordinary Cabernet land, do you think in 50 years Cabernet will still be king up there? And what are you doing now in your vineyard to adjust to the very obvious changes in growing conditions from when Justin and Ray began this journey, at least at Silver Oak back in '72?
Sure, it's a timely question for us in a variety of ways. The big thing that we've been doing or working on this last year is actually development of some new vineyard. And so after 20 years of farming the original 15 acres, we've added some more acreage to that. And with that in mind, we have adjusted basically everything. So we're trying different row orientation, different trellis style, different spacing, different vine density, different root stocks, all with the goal that we'd have basically no need for water other than natural rainfall, and that we'll have permanent cover crop across the entire floor to make this a massive carbon sink. And so essentially trying to move things fully in from the paradigm in farming or in agriculture of man is in control and that's best, to nature is in control and that's best, because the vine really knows what's best for it and what's going to produce the very best quality wine. And so we just need to provide the environment and the resources for it to do so. And so that's really kind of the perspective that we've taken, is that we want this to be here in 100 years. And we want this to have as little need from us as possible. So zero.
Gotcha. And Nate, as you mentioned a few moments ago, Silver Oak owns, a lot of vineyard land. What changes are you all envisioning so that 50 years hence, these vineyards are still going to be producing great grapes? Maybe not great Cabernet, maybe we switch, but where do you stand on that conversation?
I'm in complete agreement with Austin that there are a lot of things that we can adjust, and we've learned over the years about what matters in terms of sort of a warmer, maybe more extreme sort of environment in which to grow. So we're starting to apply those things. He mentioned the big ones, which are row direction, rootstocks, trellising, things like that. There's kind of an interesting test case for us. And we have a very old Cabernet vineyard in Alexander Valley, which is kind of a modified, what we would call sort of a modified Geneva double curtain, which looks very old fashioned, and it is very old fashioned. I think it was planted in the mid 80s. But what we've kind of found is that vineyard has actually survived climate change and this, rapidly adapting environments quite well because of its sort of lack of trellis wires and lack of control. It just sort of sprawls over, and it's an interesting vineyard block because that sort of sprawling canopy kind of provides a lot of shade, which turns out to be very important. So I think we're learning a lot about how we can adapt to the environment. And I think Austin's completely correct that we are adapting to it, not trying to make it adapt to us, which is important. But I think we have enough tools at our disposal as an industry that 50 years from now, if we want to be growing Cabernet, we'll be growing Cabernet. But it is going to take these more radical changes in terms of what we do and how we approach what we do.
Yeah, ultimately, gentlemen, is the vine a very unique plant that is able to adjust to these outside influences in a very gradual way and still express itself? Austin?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the different varieties are like different people, and they have different adaptation to their use of water. And Cabernet is particularly good at saving that water and using it miserly through the entire growing season. And so it is perhaps one of the better adapted varieties that we have for climate change and for the future. And as we plant vineyards or replant old vineyards, we are certainly looking at the old way of doing things. Plenty of vineyards were dry farmed in the 1960 and before. And so in many ways, we're moving back to some of those old practices and taking the best of those things and adapting to that to what the future brings for us.
Now, the stylistic changes, certainly Napa Valley over the last 40 years. I hate to have an alcohol-specific conversation, but we have seen a change on that, and I'm not so sure it was due to climactic conditions. It was due to taste changing, things like that. So, Nate, and I'll simplify climate change, with an ever-warming planet, much hotter growing season, are we still going to see Napa Valley-based cabs increase in alcohol level, or are you both are you recognizing that and saying we need to pull back? Can you do that? And is alcohol a conversation that you guys ever have?
Alcohol is a conversation we have a lot. Silver Oak's always, when we were founded, we were kind of actually on the more higher end of wines at the time. And as you're sort of pointing out, the world kind of changed around us. So we were, up until even the late 90s, we were still in the 12s and 13s. And you have seen that increase over the years. But to get at your question, alcohol is only a problem when you start to notice it. And I think a lot of what Austin has been talking about in terms of water and phenolics and the way the wine uses those things and that, what we're really talking about is trying to get full ripeness, full sort of physiological, full phenolic ripeness at lower sugars. And a lot of that has to do with water management. So it's very much a goal of ours to be able to continue to pick Cabernet Sauvignon at 23.5 to 24.5 and make wines that are in the high 13s to mid 14s and not see that creep up. So these water management, vine management strategies are very much geared towards that idea.
Austin, any thoughts on alcohol in the wine? I mean, I agree with Nate that it's really only a problem when it becomes noticeable, when it throws things out of balance. And certainly, the shift or the intention late in the season is to really maintain the sugar at its natural plateau. And so oftentimes, these higher alcohol wines, and certainly when alcohol becomes noticeable, is in situations where that fruit is just sitting out there and it's starting to dehydrate and the sugar is just creeping up. And therefore the final alcohol is creeping up. So, I think that there is a move in the Valley towards wines that are more balanced, more elegant, and not so heavy-handed. And it's not every wine out there, but there certainly seems to be a push towards that.
For fear that they're going to drop the curtain on the three of us, I'm just going to keep going with this stuff. So, Austin and Nate, get ready. Austin, define balance in wine for us.
When everything's there in proper proportion. Oh,
God damn it. Yes, like I see that formula behind you. I could have come up with that. You
Yeah,
can do better
exactly.
than that. What is balance,
Let me
dude?
just, I'm gonna find the Webster dictionary background. It's you know, I think that balance is not an easy thing to define. It's something that, it's like, what was the Supreme Court justice that said they knew pornography when they found it or when they saw it? Balance is something that you know when you taste it. And it's both that the wines are their proportion to what's in the wine itself, but also proportion to the site and the folks that made it.
Nate, you're up.
I think balance, when I see it, maybe an unusual definition is when I'm tasting a wine, when we have competitive tastings, we have blind tastings with the winemaking staff and others. When I'm tasting a wine and I find myself continuing to go back to it and finding different nuances and different layers and find myself looking for these things and searching for the words to describe it, that to me is balance. I think when a wine is out of balance, one thing jumps out at you as kind of the dominant factor, and that can be oak sometimes, that can be structure and tannin sometimes, it can be acidity in some wines, or just a single sort of dominant, fruit character, something like that. I think balance is really when you just keep, when a wine really holds your interest and you keep coming back to it and you keep finding new things. That's when everything is perfectly in balance.
We have a word for that at Terroir in New York City, and it's yummy, dude. Okay, so, gentlemen, if I may ask, so, Austin, if you're not enjoying your experiment number 2.7 2017 Napa Valley red wine, what wine would you enjoy in an ideal world?
Ooh, are we talking today? What time of year are we
Well, we're
talking?
talking on Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. Napa Valley time, dude.
Saturday afternoon. Man, that's a good question. I think that it's all over the map. I'd say that so some grower champagne would definitely hit the spot right now. And that's certainly, as spring rolls around, that's definitely one on steady rotation. Some Riesling would be lovely. I know that's your wheelhouse, Paul, but I very much enjoy that. And some South African whites, believe it or not, have been really kind of capturing my interest as of late. So no one answer, but that's kind of the top three anyway.
Nate, at your high school back with Austin, was he voted like the nicest guy in the goddamn school? Because he certainly comes across that way over Zoom. Just saying.
Well, I have to point out that actually the high schools that we went to were rivals in many ways. So I don't know what he was voted, and I don't care. We hate.
All right, Nate.
Um,
Listen, dude. Same question for you. If you're not drinking the Napa Valley 16 or the Alexander Valley 16 on a Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m., what grape juice are you diving in deep to?
well, so I'm here in Oakville. I've been at the winery most of the morning, catching up on some stuff, and the sun's shining. It's probably high 60s right now, and believe it or not, below what you can see, I'm wearing shorts, which is one of the beauties of the virtual world. So I got the chance to think about that a little bit, but when you asked it, the first thing that came to my mind was Vino Verde. That today is screaming for Vino Verde.
At this exact moment in time on a Saturday afternoon, wearing shorts and a checkered shirt, Vino Verde, rock and roll, dude. I love that stuff. And final question, gentlemen, because I know Mom is about to pull me off. Have you made the wine that you dreamed of making when you both were at UC Davis? Nate.
I don't think so. I think to kind of find a wine that you say, this is it, I knocked it out of the park, I'll never get any better. Not only would that be kind of hubris, I think that would take a lot of the fun out of what we do. I think, looking forward and what are we going to do better next time. I love, walking vineyards with Austin and tasting wines with him, because it's always about what are we doing? What could we do better? What problem are we trying to solve? And so I think looking back in time and saying, I've added 1,000 on that one, and I just want to recreate that. It would take a lot of kind of the joy out of what we do. So I would say no.
Cool. And 5 adjectives, Nate, to describe what that perfect wine might be, and you're not allowed to use the word balanced.
I do value probably most of all length. I think that's the one thing a great wine has to have. It has to have persistence on the finish, and it's got to have a return, and there's got to be some interest and some come hither there for one. I am a big fan just texturally of I can't use the word balance, so I would say consistency. Sort of a wine that promises one thing on the attack, or then if the mid palate kind of feels a little bit different than that, and the finish is something completely different. I think great wine has to have that consistency to front to back of I'm showing you who I am, and I'm gonna back that up as I sort of move across your palate. Precocious is one that I love, where a wine that's really aromatic and jumps right out of the glass at you. It's not, you're not in there searching for the different aromatics. It just sort of comes right out and tells you right who it is. Speaking of Vino Verde, so that's 3. Is that enough?
I'll go with those because we have to get Austin try. Okay, Austin, have you made I think it was Plato's Cave, if I'm going to my philosophy classes again, like that Plato's Cave version of perfection in wine? And if not, what are your adjectives to describe that wine for you?
Yeah, Paul, this 2017 Experiment N 2.7 is the perfect wine that I've finally created.
Wait a second, God. Is he in marketing or is he the winemaker now? God damn it.
Available at Benchmark.
Available at Benchmark. Talk to your website. No, I haven't made that, and I think that that's when you first start in wine. You have a concept that there is a perfect wine, and that you're gonna achieve that. And the more you do this, the more you realize there isn't a perfect wine, that you're just kind of on this journey, and it's a really fun ride, but there's always something else to pursue in it. So yeah, adjectives for the perfect wine: the perfect place, complete and nuanced, vibrant, and intriguing.
I love it. All right, gents. I think the folks at Benchmark have, messages have been coming up for the past hour that I, to be honest, haven't paid attention to at all. So, people ask questions that just, I can only focus on one thing, and I've got the two of you. So right now I'm over my limit, and then they want me to pay attention to a chat screen? Like, Jesus, I'm just a man here, for God's sakes. Anyway, I hope you guys were happy.
Very happy.
Cool. Well, listen, I enjoyed the conversation, gents, and it wasn't my first trip, but my second wine trip in my career was to Napa Valley, and I'm living on those memories. And you can accuse me of, not growing up, but I still love those memories because I know amongst my peers, I'm in New York, we get up in the morning and we look towards the east and we bow to Europe and all of that shit and those wines. And I have certainly been accused of not paying enough attention to what is happening in this land of ours. So I need to get back out to California more often. But truthfully, my memories of those early, the Bull U's, I was able to play ball with the 71, the 74, the 78. Those Silver Oak wines from the 80s, Spotswood back then, Groth, all of those Parker wines from that age were, oh my God, damn, were they good juice. And that still brings me through. And I love the generation of people that are coming up now in California and in Napa Valley and continuing to tell new and different and fascinating stories. So kudos, guys. Well done.
Thanks, Paul. Thank
you.
It's a generation now that's been informed by many of those same wines. So
it's amazing how many of those wines are still available now. And let's
Yeah.
be honest, Benchmark Wine Group, we can get some older juice from those guys for these things. Do you often sit down, the two of you? And I know, Austin, you're again new to the Silver Oak world, but Nate, do you ever go to the Silver Oak cellar and pull out wines from the 70s and 80s to get an idea of why this whole thing exists?
Well, believe it or not, just literally a couple of weeks ago, we went through every wine back to, I believe it was 1980. So yeah, every couple of years we pull out everything we got, and we don't really have much from the 70s anymore. So typically not that. And that's another one of, I mean, this is your job. They pay you to do this. I sit down, I taste through them. We have to update the tasting notes and the drinking windows. And so that actually is it is also a pretty tough day, tasting through 40, 60 wines in a day. But it is a lot of fun to see where we've been and where we're headed, and what the common themes are, and where we've improved for sure.
Let's be honest, Nate, you got a goddamn chef at the winery, so you can get like food coming in as you're doing the tasting. So life ain't so bad for you, buddy.
It's rough, man. It's rough around here.
So when you taste those wines from the early 80s that Justin made, how are they? Are they, and I know the vineyard sources are different and all of that, a lot has changed, but do you find, what would be a thread that would tie those Justin wines up through the Daniel wines, up to the Nate wines, other than American oak, other than 100% cab?
It's the interesting thing is that the American oak part has definitely changed. So I think in those early days we weren't often getting properly seasoned American oak, and so the oak part sort of presents itself very differently now than it used to, which is interesting. But stylistically, especially Alexander Valley, the kind of thread of acidity that runs through those wines is incredibly consistent. And actually, I was remarking to David, Duncan, and Daniel just the other day that the really interesting thing about the wines from the 80s were that they seem to be kind of in this stasis. They don't seem to change. We only do this every 3 years. They seem to be very similar year to year, which is interesting. It's almost like they're not aging in a way. They've reached this point, and they're not tired. They're still very fresh. They may or may not have much color anymore, a lot of them, but if you can get past that, there's a lot of really interesting things to find in there.
Austin, were you invited to that tasting?
No, it wasn't, Nate. We should talk about that because I know we were rival high schools, but still.
Thanks,
Nate, are you
Paul.
saying that the Dixie cups with the string between them doesn't go all the way up to Pritchard Hill? You couldn't call Austin and say, come on down?
Thanks a lot, Paul. You're creating problems for us already.
I will concur with you, Nate, that my interaction with those, the Napa cabs from the 70s and 80s, maybe I shouldn't be amazed, but how still fruit forward they are is really refreshing and cool and drinkable. Those goddamn wines are. I'm not here to say that we all need to drink a bottle of wine every goddamn day, but those Napa cabs from back in those days, sitting down to dinner, 2-3 hour dinner, and a bottle of wine per head at that, yes, goddamn it, wasn't driving home, mind you, but thumbs up, thumbs up. Cool. So do you guys know if they're going to actually cut us off, or we're going to just keep going here? Oh, whenever you are ready to say goodbye. Well, I don't want to say goodbye, goddamn. Anyway, guys, you have the rest of your day. It's a thrill to meet you. I hope when we can go out and travel again, that I will get myself on a plane and venture to the West Coast to meet you and shake your hand in person and compliment you both on what you're doing. And I want to dive a little deeper into the vineyard land that you gentlemen have the pleasure to work. So Austin, Nate, big cheers, guys. And wishing you a great spring, flowering, all of that stuff upcoming. Big cheers, all right?
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Okay, guys.